really excited to see such a great turnout for what's the official launch of the new Center for Health and Medical Humanities. Feel free to cheer if you want to. I'm Dr. Lisa de Klerk. I'm a senior lecturer in film and media. I'm one of the co-directors of the center with Stella, and there's a steering group about which I'm going to say a little bit more about. We're so pleased to have Dr. Eleanor Cleghorn here today, and I'm sure you're very pleased as well, the author of Unwell Women, A Journey Through Medicine and Myth in a Man-Made World. Stella's going to talk a little bit more, or give a bit more of an introduction to Eleanor's talk, but I want to say a few words about the center, because the talk in itself is, of course, going to be important and inspiring, but we also hope it serves to set the tone for the kind of work we want to do in the center, and I know it will. So the Center for Health and Medical Humanities brings together researchers, scholars, students, everyone really who wants to investigate the relationship of the arts and humanities to health, healthcare, medicine, and medical education. And together we seek to create a space for transdisciplinary exchange, which is the fancy word of saying that we want to bring people together from various disciplines and kind of create knowledge together. And our membership is really varied across schools and departments in the Division of Arts and Humanities: architecture and planning, arts, cultures and languages, English, history, classical and archaeological studies, philosophy and religious studies, and it's really good to see colleagues from all of those schools and departments here today as well. We have also members and associates working outside of the division, good ties with Kent and Medway Medical School, the Centre for Health Study Services at Kent as well. So we also have good relationships with the signature research themes, Future Human, Migration and Movement, Positive Environmental Futures, and we really want to try and be a hub for arts and humanities and research about health and arts and humanities to connect not just with people in the division, but also outside, and that includes, Institute of Cultural and Creative Industries, ICCI. So our ambition is to become the focal point in the university for research at the intersection of arts and humanities and health, and to use this platform to connect with others both inside the university and inside the academic community, and also the public. CHMH has a steering group, and they are all here and really excited to be working together, with Stella, Dr. Stella Balaki in English as co-directors, but also Professor Julie Anderson from history, Dr. Ruth Herbert from music, Dr. Michael Wilde from philosophy, and Professor Nicholas Chauncey from arts, from drama. And we will also be looking to appoint a postgraduate representative. So if you're a postgraduate student and you want to get involved, watch this space and talk to us afterwards, hopefully over some wine. Now, we owe some special thanks, and I'm very happy this person is here, to Dr. Helen Brooks, Director of Research and Innovation for the Division of Arts and Humanities. Helen identified the need to centralize existing efforts in health and medical humanities in the division, because it's not like there wasn't this work happening before, but people were often kind of being copied into different emails with different people, and there wasn't really a centralized point, and that's what we hope the center will become. And Helen brought us together in a working group, and sometimes things are pretty straightforward because we actually got along really nicely, people from various disciplines, and here we are today. So we hope the center continues to grow and that we can welcome more and more people into our community. And if you're asking how can we get involved, well, talk to us, but also just get involved. We have some monthly labs on the first Wednesday of every month to create a space for exchange, dialogue, and experimentation. We run a conversation about arts and humanities and health webinar podcast series, a kind of key outward-facing activity that we do. We run an MA in Medical Humanities that we're also currently developing further. We want to have a big Arts and Health Summit in May. So hopefully, between all of these activities, there's something to connect to. But really, most of all, we're looking for people who come to us and say, we'd like to do this with you, and in the space of arts and health and humanities, and would you like to support it? And yes, most likely we will be very happy to support it. So if you've got something you want to do together with the center, please reach out. I've seen that outside there are 2 tables, and it says there is a reception at 6:30, so it looks like wine and drinks and fruit juice, everything is going to be arriving. But first, of course, the reason why we're all here really is to listen to Eleanor's talk. So I'll gladly hand over to Stella to introduce us to Eleanor and the talk. Thank you.
A very, very warm welcome from me too. I'm Stella Volaki. I work in the School of English, and I am the co-director of the Center for Health and Medical Humanities. Thank you so much for joining us this evening to celebrate the launch of our center. And we are particularly honored and excited, thrilled really, to have Dr. Eleanor Cleghorn this evening, who will be giving a public lecture to mark this occasion. The title of her lecture is Medicinal Thinking, Care, Collaboration and Critique in Engagements with Medicine's Culture and History. For those of you who do not know Dr. Eleanor Cleghorn, she's a feminist cultural historian specializing in women's health and its histories. Her writing has been published in New Scientist, Vogue, Wall Street Journal, AIC, History Extra, BBC Science Focus, and Lit Hub. She's given talks for BBC History Extra, Chelsea History Festival, York Festival of Ideas, Prima Donna Festival, the Old Operating Theatre, as well as for NHS trusts and several universities and medical organizations. She's appeared live on BBC Women's Hour and NPR, as well as on numerous podcasts. Many of you will have read her utterly compelling book, Unwell Women, A Journey Through Medicine and Myth in a Man-Made World, which was published in the UK and in the US in 2021, and it's currently been translated into 10 languages. If you don't have a copy, please get one soon. Her second book, Mothers and Intimate History, is an exploration of histories of mothering, reproductive knowledge, and maternity caregiving, and it is forthcoming in spring 2024. We shall look forward to that book too. Before I invite Eleanor to give her talk, I just wanted to thank a few other colleagues. Thank you to Deborah Molloy, Research and Innovation Manager in the Division of Arts and Humanities, Communications and Press Officers Alex Heavens and Catherine Morse for publicizing this prestigious event. And last but certainly not least, my colleague, Dr. Dorothy Lahan, for helping us make contact with Eleanor. And now, please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Eleanor Cleghorn.
Hi everyone, thank you so much, Stella and Dieter, for inviting me this evening, late afternoon, to help launch the centre. It's a real honour. I'm going to start this talk with a story. Sometime in the 1640s, a young woman named Anne Green went to work as a scullery maid in a grand manor house in the village of Dunstune in Oxfordshire. The master of the house was Sir Thomas Reed, a lord of the manor and former high sheriff of the county. Reed's grandson, an uncommonly tall and strong 16-year-old, started to take an amorous interest in Anne. One fateful day in 1650, Anne, and I quote, consented to satisfy his unlawful pleasure. I'll issue a corrective. Anne was raped and she became pregnant. 4 months later, she went into labour on her own in an outhouse. Her woefully premature son was stillborn. Anne was terrified. She buried his tiny body, but it was soon discovered by another staff member in the household, and Anne was reported for infanticide. She was sent to Oxford jail, and I quote, a place as comfortless as her condition, to await trial. Anne was prosecuted under an act passed in 1624 by King James I against the destroying and murdering of bastard children. This law made any attempt to conceal the death of an illegitimate infant a crime punishable by death. And this crime could only be committed by unmarried or lewd women who were trying to avoid their shame and escape punishment. The circumstances of a woman's pregnancy or the reasons why she needed to keep her secrets were irrelevant. Only if a reliable witness could confirm that the infant was indeed born dead or had no chance of living might an accused woman have a chance of escaping her fate. So Anne was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to hang. At first light on an icy December morning, Anne was taken to the gallows. I promise this story has a happy ending. She sang a psalm and spoke out about the lewdness of the Reed family. She was pushed from the hangman's ladder. After she was pronounced dead by the prison physician, her body was laid in a humble wooden coffin and transported to the Oxford house of one Dr. William Petty, an anatomist at Brasenose College. Back in the 1620s, King Charles I had passed a law allowing physicians at Oxford University School of Anatomy to obtain the body of any person executed within 21 miles of the city for the purposes of dissection and study. Far fewer women than men were executed. The opportunity to inspect the organs of a young childbearing female were rare. Petty, along with 3 other anatomists, including Thomas Willis, who some of you might know as the physician who coined neurology, the term neurology, assembled at Petty's home the morning after Anne's body was deposited. Scalpels poised, they readied themselves to make the first incision. But then they noticed a crackle, barely audible, that appeared to be emanating from Anne's throat. She had been hanged, stamped on by a servant, and laid in a coffin overnight in a freezing cold house. But she wasn't dead. The anatomist sat Anne up and filled her mouth with hot alcoholic cordial. Her pulse was faint but present. Throughout the day, they made every effort to revive her, tickled her throat with feathers, administered enemas, let her blood, how to stay alive in the 1700s, let her blood, applied hot poultices to her breasts, and rubbed her limbs vigorously. They appointed a servant woman to lie with Anne overnight and rub her body and keep her warm. By morning, Anne could speak a little. She became a spectacle, a celebrity, a woman miraculously returned from the dead. Visitors flocked to the house, which Anne's father quickly monetized. He raised enough in donations to pay for her medical bills and lodgings. After a month of recovering in the same room she would have been dissected in, Anne could walk, eat, and speak normally. She was allowed to return to her home parish. She took her coffin with her as a souvenir. I wrote about the curious case of Anne Green in my book, Unwell Women, in a chapter titled On Her Nerves. This chapter is about the beginnings of neurology, and it's about some of the myths about female nervous weakness that were threaded into this burgeoning discipline based in scrutiny, in getting under the hood, in lifting the flesh. Anatomy at this point in the 17th century was a real let's boldly go where no one's got before mission. The interior of female bodies, where lay the organs and systems of human generation, of reproduction, have for centuries been shrouded in secrecy. Male physicians, for much of the antiquity and the Middle Ages, had veered between a forensic fascination and a horrified disdain for the female generative organs. These were the places where the products of sex took root, where shame resided, where life began. Since the 16th century, when anatomical studies of human bodies began in earnest in Europe, physicians had sought to stick their metaphorical flags in this mysterious, mutable terrain. For Petty and Willis's generation of medical men, female reproductive anatomy was a new frontier to colonize. And they would do this with surgical instruments that only they, as men, were permitted to wield, and with knowledge that only they, as men, had the right to obtain. So the anatomists might have missed out on the opportunity to dissect a dead body, but they were publicly exalted for restoring to the world a living one. Pamphlets and broadsheets about Anne's incredible story marvelled at the anatomist's godlike interventions. Poets penned verses about raising pyramids in their honour. Anne, however, was reduced to a lurid object of fascination. In print accounts of her revival, she was a lucky wench, the butt of bawdy jokes about adultery and virginity, the hangman's noose and abortive fruit. One poet proclaimed that no one should be shocked that Anne had cheated death because all women were devious creatures. Here's his poem. Well, for this trick I'll never be led, as to believe a woman, though she's dead. But beneath all the sensationalism and misogyny that surrounded Anne's case, ultimately her bodily truth, her corporeal resistance, won out. The court re-examined the evidence. Women who had worked with Anne at the Reed House were called as witnesses. They explained that Anne hadn't stopped menstruating, so she probably had no idea what was happening to her body until she went into labour. The midwife who'd examined the infant's corpse confirmed that it was too small and unformed to ever have lived. What began as a refusal to believe a young woman's testimony about her rape, about her fear, about her precarious circumstances, became a triumph of women's bodily knowing. Anne was pardoned. She lived happily for years. At the age of 36, she died in childbirth. So Anne's story almost didn't make the edit of Unwell Women. It sat there. It was one of my darlings, a curio that didn't quite fit. It's certainly an extraordinary tale, almost unbelievable, but I was determined to tell it. It exemplified something meaningful to me about the ways that medicine is never simply an objective march towards progress. It showed that medicine is so much more than a science predicated on a male gaze and the gleam of the scalpel, the authoritative gathering and gleaning. Medicine has always been deeply social, cultural, and political. And its history has always been one of people, of their bodies and their lives. Anne was able to be reduced to a medical specimen because of an unjust law that criminalised her vulnerability and those of countless other women like her, while the real perpetrator, the man who raped her, went unpunished. She was a working-class woman of no consequence, an object of use in her life and in her death. But in the end, she refused the attempts of medicine and the law, two systems of power that were overwhelmingly patriarchal, to make of her an object. She resisted medical scrutiny. Her almost imperceptible breath on that anatomy table was her body speaking up, "I will not be used for the production of your knowledge." I love imagining how the ragged crackle in her throat changed the weather in that room. The anatomist proudly on the brink of career-defining discoveries that could only be made by reducing Anne to a dissembly of parts. But in that moment, when she pulsed with life, the anatomist had to pivot to the fundamental ethical principle of their practice. First, do no harm. First, give care. As I was writing and researching Unwell Women, I chased around the archives for women like Anne. I sought out stories of women who thwarted the tidy narrative of male-dominated medical progress, or women whose experiences shone light on the unjust social realities that made people, usually marginalised people, available as instruments in the strive towards that progress. There's always a body, always a life, behind every discovery, every revelation. And the medical archive, the historical annals of medicine, are full of large and small acts of violence, of lives reduced to a very particular kind of scrutiny for a very particular kind of gain. And very often, as we know, the lives of people whose bodies have produced medical knowledge over medicine's long history have not been granted respect or humanity. When we delve into these archives, we inevitably face the colonial, racist, misogynistic ideologies that, over the centuries, have justified the use of people's bodies in the name of clinical or biomedical advancement, or in the name of social control. But at the same time, we are encountering the history of what it means to care. Caregiving is the paradigmatic ethical principle of medicine. In the Hippocratic Oath, written sometime around the late 5th century BCE, physicians who swore to do no harm also swore to, and I quote, never abuse the body of a man or woman, bond or free. Engaging with any aspect of medicine's history or with regimes of biomedical knowledge should, I think, be an ethical project predicated upon this same principle, to care, to give care. To delve into medicine from a vantage point outside the clinical is to put flesh back on the bones, blood in the cells, breath in the data. It is the work of reclamation, of restitution, and, to pick up the thread of Anne Green, of revival. Just after Unwell Women was published, I was interviewed by a group of medical students for a British medical journal podcast. One of the students was talking about their experiences of gynecology rotation, and we discussed the exploitative, racist history of gynecology specifically the horrific experiments performed by James Marion Sims, the so-called father of American gynecology. In the early mid-19th century, Sims was a physician in the state of Alabama, in a town called Montgomery, where over 2/3 of the population were enslaved people. Sims purchased young women suffering from gynecological and obstetric injuries and used them as medical specimens in experimental surgeries. 3 of his victims, Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, have, thanks to the work of historians, activists, and campaigners, been restored to visibility, and they've been afforded their rightful place in medicine's history as mothers of gynecology. For not only did Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy's bodies and suffering produce the knowledge that enabled pioneering surgical cures to be developed, they also worked as surgical assistants and caregivers in Sims' backyard hospital. So the medical students I was speaking to expressed their conflicted feelings about possibly specialising in a discipline that forged so much of its knowledge through cruelty. They also told me how difficult it was to find volunteers to train with because of the obvious vulnerability that gynae examinations require of their subjects. So they were thinking really carefully about how to transform gynecological care and procedures in ways that were trauma-informed, fully gender-inclusive, and culturally sensitive. And this concern came partly from this close attention they were paying to the fraught history of gynecology, but it was also related to what that history had suppressed and silenced, the voices and feelings of patients. Care for the patients they imagined in their future were embedded in the care they extended to historical figures like Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. And their sense of care wasn't only a matter of sympathy. The work of care, the labour of caring, came from privileging not their practice as medics, but the personhood of their patients, both now and then. Without the body, there is no knowledge, and without the life, there is no body. The history of medicine with a capital M is a history created by people whose knowledge was privileged as knowledge. And for most of history, these people were men who were afforded the right to practice medicine and the opportunity to commit their theories to writing. But there is another side to this history, a side that has mostly been rendered invisible and gone undocumented. For centuries, so much healthcare has been performed by ordinary people who care for the bodies of others. These everyday, often domestic acts of caregiving were based on intimate understandings of bodies and ailments, rooted in forms of knowledge that were spoken and shared. This rich history of care, sustained over the centuries through oral and tactile transmissions, is also the history of medicine. Midwifery and nursing, for example, are medical roles that are both feminised and traditionally performed by women. And these roles are rooted in histories of familial and domestic caregiving. Both these professions began as extensions in history of women's embodied experiences of childbearing and mothering. And both were thought to spring naturally from the female body, a body historically seen as ordained, biologically and psychologically, to give care. Forms of labour and knowledge that are regarded as innate, predicated on love and selflessness, and so often not valued as labour or knowledge. But there is nothing innate or biologically essential about caregiving. Caring takes work. It's a human art acquired through doing the work of caring. And this work is rooted in the body and in a shared sense of what it means to exist in the world in a body in all its vulnerability. During my PhD viva, I was told that loving something is not a methodology and that beginning with the body is not a critical stance. Calling things too bodily and too loving are, of course, time-honoured ways to diminish and devalue work and thought that is often done by women and by marginalised people. But in our engagements with medical culture and practice, or with histories of medical knowledge, we know that the body is only the beginning. Medical humanities as an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary set of possibilities invites us to think with and through our bodies and the bodies of others in all their mess and complexity. Caregiving is also about confronting the body in perhaps its truest sense as an unravelling, unbounded terrain. It's not sentimental and altruistic. It's challenging and confronting. This is what it means, I think, to prioritise care as a methodology, to give care as researchers, writers, artists, thinkers. We can begin with our bodies and from there move towards the bodies of others. By reaching across the boundaries of medicine with a capital M, we can privilege those forms of tactile, subjective, feeling knowledge that history has worked so hard to disavow. I've always been interested in bodies, and bodily knowing and embodiment and such, but never have I felt less embodied or more estranged from all this body than when I was at my most sick. In late 2009, I had a heart condition, a form of cardiomyopathy precipitated by my recent difficult pregnancy. As I was becoming unwell with aches in my back and chest, a kind of low-level malaise that wouldn't shift, I knew that something was really wrong. But I shut it down, as if speaking it out loud might be a bad omen or a death knell. Only when I could barely breathe or walk did I venture to the GP. Hours in A&E, an echocardiogram and bloods. More hours in the pit, an underground sort of limbo ward, full of people who are too sick to leave or too well to stay. I refused an arterial blood test, so they had to give me an ultrasound. Fluid, 5 centimetres in my pericardium. I had never been more literally bodied. The hospital gown I was given was soaked in breast milk because I was feeding my then 9-week-old son. My pulse was thrumming in my ears. I've never experienced pain like that which gripped my chest and back. I was leaking, coming undone, all emergent and out of tune. And I've never felt less like I existed in a body. That night, bloods, the ultrasound, the ECG and MRI, more bloods. Being mined for data so a cause could be attributed and a treatment pathway agreed upon, but nothing could be found. No conclusive answers as to why my heart was failing, why all my systems were on the blink. My body refused to be legible, or perhaps my doctors didn't know how to make it legible. Eventually, a common language, spoken by a visiting rheumatologist who came to see me. He ordered an immune assay, studied my notes, talked to me, and told me he was convinced I had an autoimmune disease, systemic lupus erythematosus, most often just known as lupus. He said the estrogen changes in my body after pregnancy had probably triggered this massive flare. He showed me a sheet of notepaper he'd puzzled my case out on. All that pain distilled into a series of biro figures, numbers and codes, a scrubby puzzle solved. For most people, lupus takes up to 6 years from the time symptoms are first reported to be conclusively diagnosed. My diagnosis was heightened by emergency, but I'd endured what I now know to be characteristic symptoms of lupus for about 8 years before that. Throughout my 20s, I'd suffered pains in my joints and a litany of other symptoms. And every time I went to see a GP or doctor to express my pain and hopefully receive some answers, I was dismissed out of hand. I was told it was nothing serious, probably just my hormones or growing pains. Some said my pain was the fault of my presumably reckless and hedonistic lifestyle. You probably drink too much, you're overweight, you're work stressed, you're anxious. Another smirked, try not to pay so much attention to your body. One doctor asked, is it possible that an attractive woman such as yourself might be pregnant? After years of hoping in vain for an explanation, some complex blood work, a referral, anything, I gave up. I internalized the idea that I must be too emotional, too sensitive, a hypochondriac and a hysteric. So my diagnosis, while confusing and frightening, was in many ways a relief and a vindication. In lieu of anything immediately identifiable to attribute my feminized symptoms to, my doctors had just reverted to an age-old gendered assumption that when a woman says she's in pain, the only place that pain exists is in her adult imagination. I had no real idea in the immediate wake of my diagnosis about the extent of medicine's gender problem. I came to this realization as I was recovering, when I started delving into medicine's history. Those years of unacknowledged pain, a difficult pregnancy and a near-fatal flare now had an identified cause, a disease named lupus. So I started tentatively to trace the history of a disease named lupus. At first, I was just searching for answers that my consultants couldn't give me. Why had it taken so long for me to be diagnosed? Why was the disease so complicated, so confounding to treat, and still incurable? And why, even though around 90% of sufferers are cis women and people assigned female, was the disease's gender prevalence still so profoundly mysterious? One of the first lupus patients I discovered during my early research was named Grace. In 1902, at the age of only 18, Grace was admitted to the London hospital. She was in intense pain and scarcely able to breathe. Her face, neck and torso were covered in livid rashes. For 6 years, Grace had suffered severe pain in her head and abdomen, disordered and agonizing menstruation, and rheumatic swelling that seized her joints. All her symptoms had gone undiagnosed and untreated. Grace had been in hospital for about 3 weeks when a searing pain spread across her chest and robbed her of breath. She sadly died. Her autopsy showed that the lining of her heart was inflamed with fluid. Grace was posthumously diagnosed with lupus. Her case was included in a longer clinical report on lupus patients, most of them young women, where the physicians explained that lupus was an uncertain, unpredictable female disease that could cause diffuse and destructive organ damage. So nearly a century later, I am rushed to hospital with the same heart condition that Grace suffered. Over that near century, biomedical understanding of lupus had progressed exponentially. My doctors were able to make visible the fluid that was drowning my heart. Immune assay blood tests revealed that my immune cells were misfiring against my organs. I was given steroids to stem the tide of inflammation flooding my soft tissues. But Grace, of course, fell ill before any such diagnostic technology or medication existed. She died decades before immunologists would first observe an immune cell engulf another cell and name it LE for lupus erythematosus. Had Grace been admitted to hospital when I was, she could have been saved. But despite that steady march of scientific progress that meant my life was saved where Grace's was lost, I felt an intimate sense of kinship with this girl, whom I only knew through a brief case study and a list of clinical observations in a historic hospital report. Like me, she'd experienced years of undiagnosed and unacknowledged pain. As an unwell girl in the late 19th, early 20th century, her pain would inevitably have been disregarded as some hysteric tendency, a weakness of her nerves, proof positive of her sensitive and sickly nature. The gendered misbeliefs about the legitimacy of women's pain, the prolonged Grace's suffering, had also obscured my own diagnosis. It still takes up to 6 years for a person suffering from lupus to be diagnosed, and part of this diagnostic delay can be attributed to the fact that the disease just begins with non-specific symptoms, like pain and fatigue, symptoms that are historically feminized and therefore overlooked, ignored, and disbelieved. The similarities and the grave differences between Grace's experience and my own haunted me. Anne Boyer in The Undying writes, I read somewhere that while many people have written histories of illness, no one has ever written a history of the ill. But I don't think that's true. Every person with a body is a secret historian at work on the same volume, end quote. Diagnosis might well be the work of extracting those secret histories, of holding them up to the light. Every person who is diagnosed with a named disease becomes part of its intricate histories. I owe a huge debt to unwell women like Grace. Her suffering, of course, contributed to the medical understanding of lupus that ultimately saved my life. But her presence in the archive also made me realise how deeply entrenched medicine's gender problem was. Thanks to Grace and the many other unwell women that emerged in the case studies that I was combing through, I began to learn how complicit medicine has been across its long history in conjuring myths about women's bodies and minds. And these myths have persisted as medicine has progressed from superstition to speculation to science. Today, our bodies are no longer mysterious and mutable terrain. What is going on under our skin is no shrouded secret. When we say we feel pain, the cause of that pain can be spun in a test tube or made to radiate through the action of sound and light. But before pain is given a name, a person's accounts of that pain must be listened to and valued. And for our pain to be deemed valuable enough to deserve medical scrutiny, we must be accepted first as reliable narrators of what is happening in our own bodies. When I began writing Unwell Women 10 years after I was diagnosed with lupus, the question that felt most pressing to me was this: why exactly are women and marginalised people still haunted by the historical assumption that when we say we're in pain, we're not to be trusted? Why was contemporary biomedical practice knowledge still stained with the residue of so many centuries of misogynistic myth-making? My initial impulse for writing Unwell Women was deeply personal. I wanted to trace my own experience of being doubted and diminished because of my gender when I sought medical care. But I also wanted to return to history, to a telling of medicine's history, those unwell women I'd encountered in the archives whose experiences felt achingly similar to my own. I decided to make of myself a case study. I'd be one of history's many unwell women. So I wrote a history that centred unwell women and which tried to prioritise what medicine has so often denied, ignored or silenced: the testimonies, experiences and lives of patients. So my book is a critique of medicine's historic refusal to believe women when they speak up about their pain or testify to their illness experiences. It's also a critique of medicine as an androcentric, man-made construct. For centuries, male-dominated medicine has reflected and endorsed broader patriarchal beliefs about who women are, how they should live, and what they can do with their own bodies. I'm not a medical professional. I'm an idiot. I'm a cultural historian who knows her way around an archive, and I'm motivated to do this work by my own experiences of being unwell, of being a medical subject. But I'm basically an outlier. And I'm an outlier with a very particular set of concerns and intentions. I'm often asked if I've encountered any resistance to unwell women from health and medical professionals, and thankfully I haven't. The responses I've had, especially from people working within the NHS, have so far been positive and generative. I was invited last year to share some of the research I've been doing with a group of women working in Cheshire and Merseyside NHS Trust, which represents an area of this country with some of the highest rates of maternal mortality and morbidity. These women are all frontline NHS staff who formed a voluntary network to try and ensure that women's health needs are kept high on their trust agenda during this time of ruthless funding cuts and diminished resources. Being asked to give some historical context for the reasons why, today, the health of women continues to be impacted by gaps in research, funding, knowledge and treatment was an honour, and it was humbling. I wrote in the introduction to Unwell Women that medicine's fault lines are forged by structural forces. I do not by any means believe that most doctors and health professionals are consciously belittling or undermining unwell people. Gender bias in medicine and all the intersecting biases that disproportionately affect racialised people, those facing economic and social insecurities, and people of marginalised genders have been baked into medicine across its long history. So it was really important to me to expose how these biases and disparities that continue to impact unwell people, and also the people who care for them, became so ingrained into medical knowledge in the first place. In this sense, I hope that critique can also be perhaps a form of collaboration. For many of us working across the medical humanities, forging a dialogue between the realm of the clinical and biomedical and that of illness and disability as lived, bodied experience is a vital motivation. My intent when exposing the long and troubled history of medicine's androcentric history was not combative or antagonistic. I wanted to contribute to a broader understanding of medicine's social, cultural and political resonances. I wanted in part to show how profoundly medical thinking has shaped the world since the beginnings of modern medicine in ancient Greece some 2,000 years ago. My book is certainly full of villains, eye-wateringly sexist 19th century gynecologists, retired professors who believe that educating women would lead to the ruination of ovaries and society. He's a charm, that one. So-called progressives who promoted racist and ableist ideologies. Eugenicists who sought to perfect the future by controlling and denying certain women reproductive autonomy, and so on, and so on. But I chose to tell these stories because medical knowledge has at certain parts throughout its history been exploited and manipulated by those whose attention was not to care or do no harm. But this is not the only history I present in Unwell Women. My book is also a history of medicine as a strive towards justice, as an art of tending and recovering, of resistance and resilience. And it's a history foremost of unwell women themselves, one that I was only able to construct because I myself became an unwell woman. I'm often asked the age-old question of whether doing this kind of work is therapeutic. The answer is most definitely no. But I certainly could not have done this work if I hadn't become ill. Susan Sontag, in Illness's Metaphor, famously describes illness as, and I quote, the night side of life. But the night enables a different kind of seeing. I could never have anticipated in those early days, when I was trying to just cleave out some way to make meaning from being unwell, that I would have written this book. And while writing this book, I could never have anticipated the life it might have, the ways it might resonate with others. On the day Unwell Women was published, I was interviewed live on air for Radio 4's Women's Hour in a programme dedicated to the government's women's health strategy. See what's happened to that. Which had closed its public call for evidence that week. Before my interview, I stood in the green room completely paralysed with fear as I listened to Emma Barnett tear Nadine Dorries a new one by the experience. Over the last nearly year and a half since Unwell Women was published, I've been invited into conversations about how women's pain is ignored and downplayed, for example, during gynae procedures and things like IUD insertion and removal. I was asked to contribute a contextual programme essay for a play directed by Mark Rylance about Dr. Semmelweis, the Austrian 19th century obstetrician who discovered that hand washing led to a reduction in rates of childbed fever in maternity hospitals. These and the many other opportunities I've had to make the history I present in Unwell Women of any use, culturally or clinically, have been incredibly meaningful. Above all, what has mattered most to me is the way the book has chimed with unwell people. Many readers have written to me to let me know that understanding that their particular and individual experiences of dismissal, neglect, or misdiagnosis have a history has meant something really important to them. That they too felt a sense of kinship and community in knowing that they were part of this history. Work in the medical humanities, in the many disciplines through which medicine with a capital M can be expanded and reimagined, is the work of care, collaboration, and critique. This work doesn't stand in opposition to the clinical. It stands in solidarity as the connective tissue between the objective, empirical practice of solving the mysteries of the human body and the bloodied, intimate pulse of illness as it is lived. Flesh on the bones. Thank you.